Okay, YouTube, this is part 2. Henry Reynolds on the Forgotten War.
Surprising them and, and coming upon them by surprise and ambushing them and spearing them from behind. I mean, these things they endeavour to do, but as in the rest of the world, the balance had been dramatically tipped in favour of the Europeans.
Historian and author Henry Reynolds discussing Australia's frontier wars. You're with Big Ideas on RN and online. I'm Paul Barclay. You can podcast or stream this conversation and other Big Ideas discussions and talks from our website at abc.net.au/Radio National. You can also get involved in the Twitterverse and tweet us at RN Big Ideas. From the late 19th century through to the middle of the 20th century, the story of Australia's frontier conflict was virtually airbrushed from history, says Henry Reynolds. The widely held view was that Australia, unlike other countries, had experienced a peaceful journey to nationhood. So when did we begin to talk about our more violent past? Let's return to my conversation with Henry Reynolds.
The significant event intellectually was the Boyer Lectures of Bill Stanner in 1968, when he talked about the Great Australian Silence. And there was a Great Australian Silence. And in that period, from, say, the 1880s right up to the 1960s, it was possible, because the Aborigines had been written out of the story, it was possible to talk about a uniquely peaceful society. I mean, I tell this story many times. When I arrived at James Cook University many years ago and was told I was teaching Australian history, and I was given as my textbook Gordon Greenwood. Greenwood edited Australia, Social and Political History. I mean, he was the great man of UQ. And in its way, it was an important book, and it was by far the most widely used textbook in senior schools and universities. And it had nothing about the Aborigines there. They weren't even in the index. They had been literally written out of Australian history. And so if you write them out, what are you left with? You're left with Ned Kelly, and you're left with a few other bushrangers, and you're left with Eureka Stockade, but a few Unionists got killed. But apart from that, what a peaceful place it was. And that was a very nice story, But nations want nice stories.
We're willfully blind. Is that what you're suggesting by this title, Forgotten War? Because it implies that we knew there was a war, and indeed we spoke of it being a war at the time. It was reported in the newspapers as war. You go through the archives and you find reference to it being a war. This was not a hidden truth then. We are so reluctant to use that term today. We've chosen to forget, have we?
I think that's right. I mean, Forgotten War was very much imposed by the publishers. I wanted to call it Conquest, but they felt that Forgotten War, and I appeased them. I said, all right, if that's what you think is the best title, let's go with it. I'm not sure that Forgotten is quite the right word.
I mean, maybe I shouldn't be getting you to justify a title to a book that you're not entirely comfortable with.
It is I mean, at the beginning, yes, there were people who said, let's forget about it, let's not talk about it. There was a willful hiding of it for people who were close to it. But on the other hand, there were old settlers who would say, and this is certainly so in Queensland, yes, of course, in the old days, I had to raise my rifle and, I had to shoot down the wretches. But by and large, it was best forgotten. It was best forgotten. And that is indeed what happened. But, I mean, it was never forgotten by Indigenous Australians. I mean, they had their own history. They had their own history that they passed down by word of mouth. And they never had any doubt that this is what had happened to them and their people and their ancestors. But in terms of white history, yes, it was telling a nice story for the new nation.
Well, the death toll, the approximate death toll that you refer to in the books, around about 30,000 deaths of Indigenous Australians and perhaps several thousand settlers who die. And when you compare that to the wars that we commemorate, from the Boer War, from Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, the Gulf War, those wars that I've just listed, and the people who died there, who are commemorated at the Australian War Memorial, of course, they rather pale into insignificance compared to the numbers who died in the frontier wars, don't they?
They do. And I mean, I'm very modest. When many years ago I said we must assume that it was at least 20,000. That was very early, you know, when we were beginning to do this work. And I mean, I think now 30,000 is indeed, once again, the bottom of the range. And I mean, the important work being done in Queensland by Robert Jensen and Ray Evans is going to push that figure up. And I think that is realistic, that it was more. It does get up to the range of the deaths in the Second and even the First World War.
Mm. Recently I spoke with the American novelist Philip Meyer, who, an interview, by the way, that I'll run on Big Ideas later this year. His new novel, The Sun, takes on the foundation mythology of America, the mythology of how the West was won. I'm wondering how the frontier wars in Australia compare with the so-called American Indian Wars. Are there some parallels there?
Yes, there are. I mean, in both New Zealand and the United States, there is a recognition that they were wars, the Maori Wars. But if you look up, you know, official lists of American wars, then all the Indian wars are included, even quite small ones that I'd never heard of. So there is that recognition that what was happening was war. But this is partly because from the very start the Indians were recognised as being the landowners and having a form of sovereignty. And so they were people with whom you could make treaties, but they were also people with whom you could go to war. So there's always that recognition in the United States. But in terms of the extent of the conflict and the number of people killed, I mean, the Australian frontier wars are certainly the equivalent of the wars on the Western Plains of the United States, and I think more significant than the Maori Wars.
Mm. You mentioned treaty there. Was there ever any suggestion at the time that this frontier conflict could have been avoided if compensation had been paid or if a treaty had been struck? Was that discussed? You know, in the...
Yes, it was. I mean, that was exactly what George Arthur, the governor in Tasmania, I mean, I think probably the most competent British official that ever came to Australia. And Arthur indeed says this. He says, look, we made a great mistake when we first came to Australia that we had no treaty. There was no way in which we could deal with the question of land and the transfer of land. And he says this again and again. Now, it's my view that when he returned to Britain in 1836, he was there for 6 months. He then went on to Canada. And that was the period when they were discussing what to do about New Zealand. Now, I'm convinced that the Treaty of Waitangi came out of the Australian experience. That he said, you've got to go and start with a treaty, as much as anything else, to control the settlers. So, yes, there was that very keen sense that where it had gone wrong was that we didn't recognise these people as having land ownership or people who could actually engage in negotiation and to agree about treaties. Now, how that would have worked in Australia, it's not clear, but there certainly were people who saw this as the key problem.
There were no even tentative discussions, though, down that route?
Well, I mean, John Batman comes out of the Tasmanian experience and goes to Port Phillip with a treaty. Now, the problem with that is that, you know, it's a Crown prerogative. It's not, people can't make treaties, only the Crown. Not even Parliament. You know, it's an executive power, and no British government was going to recognise a private treaty. So Batman tried, and undoubtedly I think he knew that that was the thinking in Tasmania among the officials, that a treaty was what you required. So that was a serious attempt at a treaty. It wasn't just a ruse. I think it was a serious attempt to have a treaty, and there were always individuals who in a way worked out their own accommodation. And there are quite a few of those in Queensland. You know, when they're left to themselves, they decide they've got to come to some agreement. And what happens in North Australia, I mean, the important thing, when it would have been possible for the settlers to have wiped out the Aborigines, it's the very time when they need them. They desperately need Aboriginal labour. And so once they have imposed their will, they don't want them killed, they want them to be alive, and they want children to be born, and they want more and more people they can train up to be their servants.
We tend to view the New Zealand Maori as a much more of a warrior culture than the indigenous Australian. In fact, one of the myths around Australian Aborigines has tended to be over the years that they were passive. How does the Aboriginal resistance compare to the Maori resistance?
Well, it's very different. I mean, in the classic period of the Maori Wars. I mean, the worst thing to do for any 19th century people resisting European imperialism was to get together in large groups and try and fight in a traditional way, because it simply meant the Europeans could use their firepower on you. And so the Maoris had a warrior culture, but it meant they had forts and they had guns and they came together in large groups. Now, that is exactly what couldn't happen in Australia, so therefore it was much more scattered. But certainly in terms of Tasmanian, I mean, these people they didn't even have spear throwers, they didn't have barbed spears, they only had clubs and spears, without just sharpened wood spears. And yet they were able to exact this incredible death rate on the Europeans. They were as effective as the Maoris were, despite, as I say, having none of those things which were seen as which made Maoris worthy warriors.
Among the first names on the Australian War Memorial Roll of Honour are those from a New South Wales volunteer regiment who were sent to Sudan in 1885 to fight on behalf of the Empire against those who were rebelling against the British-backed regime in Sudan. Most of the people there died actually of disease. It was a rather ill-fated mission, actually. And yet those people who died there were acknowledged, and you can see their names listed in the War Memorial today. At the same time that this small regiment had been sent over to Sudan, the most brutal of the frontier conflict was taking place in Queensland, the victims of which have gone completely unrecognised. This is a very interesting part of the book, actually. You draw a stark contrast here. Tell us a bit more about that contrast that you establish in the book.
Yes, well, the Sudan contingent, I mean, it was a fateful event because it gave the British the idea that, we can get these colonials to come and fight for us. So it was a most unfortunate example of what was to follow. But yes, they virtually saw no conflict. They died of typhoid. Not all of them even there. I mean, some of them died on the way home, and one of them died in Sydney. So he still is up there in the War Memorial. Whereas in North Australia, around 1885, it was a period of intense conflict because they were moving into all of those areas in North Queensland, across the Northern Territory, the great expansion of the pastoral industry in the Northern Territory. They were moving up into Central Australia. They were moving in for the first time into the Kimberley, looking for gold. And they were also, there was intensifying activity on the sea frontier around Pearls, around Torres Strait and right across the north. So it was a period of probably among the most violent years in the frontier conflict.
Systematic killing,
yes.
Really.
Well, systematic in that the Aborigines were strongly resisting. And if you are going to try and occupy territory with a small number of people, then you're going to have resistance, and you have to fight. I mean, many of them say we have to fight for our life, and that is true. They were fighting for their lives, and they were certainly fighting for the country, but they were also fighting to survive against people who were extremely hostile and out to kill them. The idea that somehow it was just because the settlers were brutal and racist, I mean, that doesn't touch on it really. They were killing because they would have been killed themselves. Because they were right across North Australia, this vast territory, they were pushing into this new country. And so there is this extraordinary contrast. But I mean, the things they say about the Sudan contingent, I mean, one of the comments is that when we saw our troops on parade with the guards, then we knew we had arrived, we had become a nation. So the idea that you became a nation in 1915 had been repeated at the Boer War and had been repeated in 1885. It just, we kept needing to be reborn through war.
As you say, we revere in Australia those who die in combat, especially in wars in foreign countries.
Chaotix.
And I suppose the revival in memorialising Anzac Day seems to suggest that the reverence to our war dead is, if anything, growing. I was interested in what you said earlier, that you think this has perhaps been an orchestrated campaign to take attention away from the frontier wars. But do you think that, can you ever imagine a time when we place the frontier wars in the same position in our national history, in our national imagination as the Great Wars, the First and Second World War? Is that something you can ever imagine happening?
Well, I can imagine all sorts of things.
Realistically happening?
Well, the problem is that the current, it's not as if the great celebration, the cavalcade of celebration and commemoration of war has just happened spontaneously. It has been orchestrated and paid for on a massive scale by government. It is a degree of public interference in history that could only be compared with regimes that we would find distasteful. That is, it is a deliberate creation of this idea about war that is paid for. And I mean, they just recently voted 115 million
of history.
For the celebrations. This new government will no doubt add to that, and no one, as far as I know, even questioned that.
They would perhaps argue that they're simply responding to the community sentiment towards those people who sacrificed their lives for Australia.
Well, you can never tell with these. I mean, certainly there was an eager response in the community. I'm not suggesting it's entirely created by government, but I mean, tens and hundreds of millions of dollars goes wonders if you're promoting history. And remember, complete free access to all the schools in Australia. You send stuff to every school. You send curriculum material. You then follow up and ring schools and say, what battles are you teaching? I mean, there's a tremendous campaign to indoctrinate the young in a way that if other societies did it, we'd be horrified.
In a review of your book by Peter Stanley, the former chief historian of the Australian War Memorial, he asks the question, can a devotion to Anzac coexist with a willingness to accept that frontier conflict occurred? What do you think?
I see absolutely no reason why not. I mean, there's no doubt that Anzac was a terribly traumatic event.
Fucking stupid idea.
You see,
Let's invade Turkey.
If you concentrate on the soldiers and their bravery and their heroism and their suffering, you don't ask those big questions. What were they doing there? What possible advantage was there to Australia? Now, in the small town I lived just outside Hobart, there were 40 young men from that district who died in the First World War, and there were 3 brothers from where I live now. Now, whatever were they doing there? What possible advantage was it to Australia for them to be there?
None.
It would have been far better for Australia if they'd all stayed home and raised families.
Yes.
And helped develop the country.
Apart from the fact
but we can't,
that then Australia would have their DNA in the gene pool.
Pointless.
The DNA for saluting
even
flags
now we can't say that.
and responding to fucking bugles. We don't want that DNA.
30 or 40 years
we need
ago
it to be composting in Gallipoli.
Yes, yes.
So the right thing happened.
You think that those who were killed in the frontier wars should be formally recognised by the Australian War Memorial? I understand the former Governor
the meek
General
shall
Sir
inherit
William
the
Green
earth.
Is also.
Okay, that's the end of part 2 of Henry Reynolds, the history of the Forgotten Wars.